Here at the Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have a planning meeting every quarter that's open to the whole community, where we consider suggestions for talks that members of our community would like to give. For today, please join me in welcoming Eva, who will be giving a talk on Memetic Hygiene, Defense Against the Irrational. Eva, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk today about how not only how we can set up a kind of a memetic immune system for ourselves so that we are not letting in bad ideas that are false or destructive to our goals. And there are multiple pieces to that. You can find lots of details on individual fallacies and persuasion strategies that you can avoid and things like that. I actually put some resources into the chat if you want some books to follow up on some of the things that I'll say here that go into more detail about individual specifics. But I wanted to talk about some of the general principles. And the general principles of skepticism, of questioning what you read and hear and are told, starts in childhood. So what we want to do with our children, and what we hope our parents have done for us, is to help them develop that immune system in the first place. And that starts with stories. We want to tell our children stories, we want to read them stories, and we want to have them start thinking of stories as something that people create. People tell stories. Stories are not something that are passed down to us from God. They're not something that is created out of whole cloth and it's all guaranteed to be true. We should tell our kids stories that are not true. Not to lie to them, but to show them that there is such a thing. There are stories that are not true. They can still be fun. They can still teach us things, but they should not be accepted as fact. Now, I did this largely by accident with my middle child, who was the first one I'd raised from baby, because I started off raising her with fairy tales, reading her lots and lots of fairy tales. Now, fairy tales are folk tales that are related across cultures in a lot of cases. Many of them have very ancient roots, and you'll see variations on them. So if you go to the library, you can find 5 or 6 different versions of Cinderella of different ages from different cultures. And they're different. They have different details in them. Some of them even have different principles that they're teaching, if you look at what they're carrying forward. So if you start with that, you're teaching your kid there are different stories that can be told about the same ideas and the same characters, depending on what you want to get across. So I started with that. And then I had this copy of Genesis illustrated by the underground cartoonist Robert Crumb. Now, this is an amazing work, and he is not in any way mocking Genesis or selectively editing it. He is using the entire translated text of the book of Genesis and illustrating it as faithfully as he could, and in some cases illuminating some things I hadn't noticed in the text. So I have this book. It's terrific. And my very young daughter wanted to read it. I'm like, ugh, okay, so we've got this underground comic artist. Okay, naked people, fine. We've got the Garden of Eden and all, but I'm worried about the content. You know, I'm an atheist. I don't necessarily want her absorbing Genesis as a text. Well, we can talk about it. So I started reading it to her as a story because she really wanted to hear it. And in the beginning of Genesis, there are 2 stories about the creation of the world. They're put back to back, and a lot of biblical believers take them as one story, but they actually contradict each other. So I highlighted this as I read it. I said, okay, now we have these steps in this order. Now we have these steps in this order. You know, either humans are created male and female both at once, or we have one and then the other. There's some other differences in the story. So I flagged that as we read it. Like a year later, we're reading a book about evolution. It was actually called Darwin and Evolution for Kids, I believe. And there's an intro part where they're talking about the cultural context for Darwin's discoveries. And they mention the concept of biblical literalism. Now, this kid does not know what biblical literalism is, so I have to define it a little bit. Okay, so there are people who believe that the stories that are in the Bible are true and it's the most important thing in the world to believe them completely. And she thought about this and she blinked at me. She said, but there are two stories. And I went, whoa, I did something right. Because she already had the concept that there are stories, that they are told by humans, and that they can contradict each other. So she was not vulnerable to the idea that one should take a particular text as sacredly true. And she was looking at it critically so she could see there was going to be a problem if you were going to take a text as varied as the Bible as literally true. Which parts? Everybody who takes it as literally true is deciding which parts they're taking. So this is a really important part of having a memetic immune system, is starting from the basis of people tell stories. Stories are not guaranteed to be true. If your parents did not do this for you, if they raised you with the idea that some stories are never to be questioned, it's a little harder to defend yourself against false ideas. But if you're here, you're already doing that and you've started that process. So we want to do that for ourselves, and we want to do it for children if we have children. Besides the idea of stories, we also want to talk about religions. The book Parenting Beyond Belief is really useful for raising children as atheists. It's really important to let kids know that there are religions out there and the kinds of forms they take, because if you've never encountered religion before, what's going to happen is you go to college, somebody tells you about Christ, you're going to be a believer. That happens to a lot of people. That's a case of not having any resistance against a new idea. If you know that idea exists and you've been taught some of the problems with that idea and where it leads, then you're not going to just fall into it and be infected by it. We also want to talk about things like advertisements. Why are they telling us this? Why are they showing us this image? So we can do a lot to set up a memetic immune system, a defense system against false or destructive ideas early on. Now, as adults, we have a responsibility to filter our own ideas. As kids, we mostly get fed a lot of ideas and we have to believe a lot of them because we can't test them all ourselves. We have to take our parents' word for it. Once we are adults, we need to start being skeptical on our own about all the messages we take in. And we are bombarded with information all the time. People tell us things. We read stuff on the internet. We see stuff on TV. We see a sign. We get a message from the government. You know, we have all of these messages coming in all the time. And we don't have the time or the energy to filter everything. So some of it gets in and we end up with some stupid ideas in our head sometimes. But as we see stuff come in, and particularly if it's something that contradicts something that we thought was true and it's going to have important effects on our decision making, we need to develop the habit of questioning these ideas. And one of the ways that we question ideas is to think about where they're coming from. Now, this is easy to completely overlook, especially on the internet where it all kind of looks the same. Look at who is saying this and why they might be saying it. So it might be, oh, this is my friend who I trust who's saying this, but they're not actually the ones who had the evidence for it. They're just passing on a link from somebody else who is maybe a friend that they trust. So let's go back to who said this in the first place and whether we actually have any basis for trusting their word. It might be that this is just some person who came up with this idea and there's no reason to believe them whatsoever. It might be that they are actually an expert in the field. Maybe it's a virologist who is telling you about the probabilities of catching COVID, and that is probably somebody that you'd want to listen to more than your random neighbor down the street, unless your neighbor is a virologist. There are also cases where you might look at who is saying it because they might have reason to lie to you or to mislead you or to leave information out. If this is somebody who will profit from your believing something that's false, you might want to question what they're saying even harder. If they have a political position that will be supported by your believing something false, that's something you want to look at really hard. If this is a person in your life who is telling you something they'd really like you to believe because then they can get something from you, that's another situation. So we want to look at the source. We also want to look at how this information fits with things we already know. Now, here we have to be careful because we might be wrong, right? Some of the things we already know might be wrong. But we want to look at how the whole system compares. Do I have an already existing system that explains the evidence that I've seen in the past in a really convincing way that I have really good evidence for, and then I'm getting this brand new, really surprising idea that contradicts that? Well, then I want to question that new idea very carefully. I want to see not only what evidence is there for this new information, but also how do they explain the existing things I have that contradict that? Is there some explanatory power that comes along with this that makes sense of something that maybe I couldn't make sense of before? Or do we just have a harsh contradiction that I need to somehow resolve with more information? Can I hold these two ideas in my head? Will I think about which one is more likely to be true? Is there some other explanation that could explain all of the evidence? Or do I actually need to toss out all my old ideas because this new one is really well grounded? But you want to be careful with that. Because usually we do have a working system of ideas already, and we shouldn't throw it out from just one new piece of information. The new piece of information needs to be well grounded. You need to have a good source for the information that's saying it's well grounded. And it needs to be internally consistent with the evidence that comes in. You also need to look at, is this actually testable? You know, is somebody telling me this and I'm going, oh, well, I can't disprove that. Well, can you prove it? If I could never disprove it, then you probably shouldn't take it in as a piece of information. I need to think about, what would it take for me to say, oh, this isn't true? And then go looking for that. One of the things that it's really hard for people to do is look for disconfirming evidence. We are great at going, okay, I think this is true, and yep, that shows it, and that shows it, and that shows it. Okay, I'm done, it's true. And we forget to go, what would it look like if this weren't true? Or what would it look like if it were true that I now need to go looking for, because if that's not there, this must not be true. We need to look for the pieces of information that are not immediately apparent. This kind of bias in what evidence we look for is really, really common and really hard to avoid. So I wanted to cover a couple of types of that. Besides the confirming evidence we want to look for, sure, that's usually really easy to think of. There's the missing evidence that you would expect to see. So you need to think out a step. What would be true if this were true? What would be true if this weren't true? And go look for both kinds. And bias in the evidence can come in the form of survivor bias. One kind of famous example of survivor bias is there were airplanes that were coming back in World War II with bullet holes in various places. And they were looking at where the bullet holes were and going, okay, well, they come back with a lot of bullet holes in the wings and the tail. So probably we should put some more armor on the wings and the tail to protect them. And then somebody pointed out that we were only seeing the planes that came back. The planes that did not come back were the ones that got bullet holes through the cockpit or the engine. And so that was a really important thing to notice, that it was not so important to protect the parts that they could fly back home if they got shot in. It was more important to protect the parts that we never saw get shot, because those planes never came home again. So survivor bias is one really important piece. Think about what you are not seeing because it's missing from evidence you could possibly have. Think about selection bias. For instance, if you send out a survey asking whether people like to answer surveys, you're going to get a lot of yeses and not a lot of nos. Availability bias, what we can think of most easily is not necessarily what's most common. And in some cases, we can have defined terms in a way that will rule out exactly the thing we're looking for. So those are all ways we can bias the evidence that we're actually looking at, and we want to think about, what am I missing? When someone presents you with a claim, we also want to look out for strategies they may be using to stop you from thinking rationally and analyzing the claim. There are lots and lots and lots of these. There's one book on this. Let's see, not that one, this one. The Psychology of Influence by Robert Cialdini. or influence the psychology of persuasion, I guess is what it's called. This one's a really good book for looking at the kinds of strategies that salespeople and politicians will tend to use to keep you from questioning or thinking about the claims that they're making. So for instance, they might give you a free gift and get you thinking all friendly about them and forgetting to check their claims. They might show you a fake expert. Oh, this guy's in a white suit, so I'm not going to think very hard about whether he's a doctor or an actor. They can completely swamp you with arguments, none of which they can actually back up, but you don't have time or brain space to think about it. That's called a gish gallop. If somebody just swamps you with not particularly strong claims and you can't face them all. That doesn't mean they're good. That just means there were a lot of them. So all these kinds of strategies are things to watch out for, and there's lots and lots of detail about those. So we want to have a good grounding for thinking skeptically, starting with the idea that people tell stories. We want to question the new ideas that are coming in. The other really important piece of this is we want to be skeptical about the beliefs we already have. Like I said, we as kids, we just have to accept things that people tell us because there's so much we don't know. And we are designed to absorb information from our parents and from our environments. And so sometimes when we get older, we have to go through and pick some of that stuff out that maybe wasn't right. Maybe we got the wrong impression, or, our mom didn't know where milk comes from. I don't know. Sometimes you have stupid information that comes in. So we want to go through and pick things out, even if they're very long standing and we've built a lot of stuff on them. In fact, those are the most important ones to question. It's trickier to question information that you've already treated as an axiom. We all have some false beliefs, and most of those false beliefs are not important. If you have a wrong impression about some bird behavior that you're never going to meet in your life, it really doesn't matter probably. We might misremember something. We might misunderstand something we read. We might have been misinformed. But most of them don't really affect our lives. But some of our false beliefs can cause us unnecessary pain and difficulty because we actually take action based on them that is maladaptive. Because we have a misunderstanding about something or because we've been misled about something, we make decisions that are not rational. So we don't want to build our belief structures on top of false beliefs. That's going to lead us really astray. It could be because we were raised with a religion that came along with a whole bunch of pieces, and maybe we've gotten rid of the religion in general, but we still have pieces of it hanging on that are affecting our decision making. It could be we've got undermining messages in our head that we got from our parents or from a past partner who's emotionally abusive. Sometimes we end up believing things about ourselves because of things like that. Or we could internalize something from a traumatic experience, either as a child or as an adult, that led us to believe a general principle out of one incident. That's how phobias develop, is we have a bad experience and we generalize. And so we can end up not even realizing that we hold a belief that is shaping our decisions. So because we can have these false beliefs that are shaping our decisions, we need to examine our existing beliefs. So if I notice something that I believe, it's a good idea for me to question it. I can't question everything. We don't have time or brain space to question everything. But if I notice something that either is getting in my way a lot, like, oh, I would love to do this thing, but this is true, I should maybe look at that. This is true. Oh, this is the reason I can't do something. Then I should make sure it's really true and useful. Or if I notice myself believing something that I don't quite know how to explain, I should question that hard too. Let's say I notice I trust somebody who I don't really know, or that I don't trust them. I might look at that and go, why is it that I think this person is trustworthy or untrustworthy? Have I observed things about them? Maybe there are little things that are getting at my intuition that are telling me I shouldn't trust them, in which case I should probably notice which those are. Or is it just that I've decided redheads aren't trustworthy, in which case I should maybe shift my head a little because that doesn't make sense. Or maybe every time I shake someone's hand and he's got a really strong, firm handshake, I trust that guy. that's maybe not such a great idea either. Or if I'm convinced I'm intrinsically bad at math, that's an example of a place where that belief is holding me back. That's going to keep me from doing a lot of things in life if I believe that that's true. So that's a belief that I should question closely. The fact that I have maybe always had bad experiences in math classes and been shamed for not doing well at math problems is not, in fact, proof that I can't learn math. In real life, I teach math, and I teach math to lots of people who thought they just couldn't do math, that their brains didn't work that way. So I have lots of disproof on that one. If you believe you can't do something because you've had bad experiences being taught it before, that is not good evidence that you can't learn it. That's just evidence you haven't learned it yet. Big difference. So that's one example that's really common for people to hold in their head that limits them and is not actually true or useful. So we want to look for counter evidence to things to beliefs we hold that we maybe have not been questioning in the past. And we want to look for alternative explanations for existing evidence. If I jump to one answer, try to find different answers that could also explain that. We want to think about if I have a belief, I should be able to say why I have that belief. I should be able to point to a few things. And if I can't do that, I need to look really hard at whether that belief is serving me at all. Many of us here have had the experience of realizing that our belief in God was unsupported by evidence. And once they let that drop away, suddenly this whole huge, vast belief structure falls away on top of it. Of course, we don't want to do things like decide that ethics doesn't matter anymore because there's no God, because of course it does. We just need to put it on a different foundation from God exists and is telling us what to do. So if we're taking out an important underlying belief, we need to look at what we want to keep and what we don't that we think goes along with it. It may or may not go with it. So in summary, in order to avoid being misled by false or destructive beliefs, we need to, 1, develop our awareness that messages may be true or false or misleading or meaningless, and that they should be questioned. We need to develop the habit of testing new claims against available evidence and also looking for missing evidence. And we need to develop the courage to question our own existing assumptions. The briefest way to say this is don't believe everything you think.
All right. Thank you, Eva. Let's all unmute ourselves for a moment and give a quick round of applause. Thank you, Eva.